We were not just dancing to the timer music. Anyway, welcome to another episode of our Industry Explorers live stream, where we're here to talk about how to start your career in various industries. Today, we're talking all about tech development, and we're going to open one heck of a can of worms today. Today's guest is Chris Jenkins. He is the Chief Digital Officer for the Symphony Agency, a healthcare communications and technology firm. He's worked in technology since 1998, primarily in healthcare and telecom spaces, and was the 2017 TBBJ CIO of the Year. He's also a serial entrepreneur, sitting on the board of several emerging technology startups. Jinx, how are you today?
I'm fantastic. It's Thursday, and we've got great plans for the evening, and hype about this interview. So let's go.
Awesome. First question, what does it mean to be the 2017 TBBJ CIO of the Year? That sounds fancy.
Yeah, I mean, I got to say, it was pretty fancy. Tampa Bay Business Journal is, the big industry trade journal in this area, and they recognize a number of executives at various company sizes in the industry. And so in 2017, I was picked as the small business CIO of the year, basically in regards to a technology initiative that I'd led at that organization. So it worked out well.
Very nice.
I got a fancy plaque on my wall, too.
Oh, I wish we could see it, man. Oh. Yes. Ooh, it's one of those glass ones. That's real fancy. I love that. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. Thank you, David, for joining us. Yeah, it's a big acronym. I almost flubbed on all my words. I at least flubbed on one already. So, if that's any indicator of how this interview is going to go. No, I'm totally kidding. It's totally relaxed. And Jinx, let's start at the very beginning, because that is a very good place to start. What is tech development?
Well, I mean, in general, and it's kind of I don't often see tech and development together in the same phrase, but development in technology mostly relates to coding, to building things, and not just writing the actual code that runs software, but also, the infrastructure work that code runs in, and, the entire process of troubleshooting and deploying that code into a production environment. So there's a ton of jobs that are in that umbrella. I think we can talk about a few of them today.
That's my next question. Can you name different types of developer job titles?
Sure. I mean, a lot of folks, if you're just getting in early, you're probably going to be something like a junior developer, junior programmer, or there are more casual titles like a web designer, even. That may mean that you're writing a little bit of code as part of a less programming intensive role. Over time in the industry, you may go up to be a senior developer, or if you start getting into the real fancy enterprise stuff, a senior software engineer, or similar titles like that.
So what are some of the similarities between all these different job titles in the world of development?
Well, I mean, generally, that they all have one thing in common, which is you're there to solve a technology problem. It might be a problem based on, the environment that the code needs to run it. It needs to be secure. It needs to be scalable. It needs to perform quickly when lots of people use that product at the same time. Or it may be, you need to accomplish some incredible logic that takes into account many, many different factors. How many users are using this platform in a specific regional area, or at a time of day or night, or jumping through security hoops. You want to make sure that this communication is super secure from one side to the other and doesn't easily allow it to be snooped on. Problem solving is that key thing, though. You have to be maybe a puzzle person. If you're the kind of person who likes figuring out how things work and really getting into the nitty gritty of them, and you're okay with working in a virtual environment, any development job is potentially a good match for you.
So if you are someone, does it take someone who is incredibly gifted in math or in science or in communications to work as a developer?
I know there's a lot of jobs where it really takes a certain kind of person who has a certain kind of outlook, right? If you're doing that, rope climbing, rigging, or high wire work type stuff, you have to be the kind of person who's super comfortable being high above the ground. With development, I don't think it's quite that cut and dry, because there are so many different types of development that you can do, and they require different kinds of skill sets. Like, I think one of the ones that I hear most commonly is the math question. Do you have to be great at math to be a developer? As a flat answer, no. However, if you're going to work with algorithms, or if you're going to work with applications that require a significant amount of scaling, there are places where math becomes a priority. But the entire industry is so wide that you can be the artsiest person in the world who struggles with math constantly. But if you can handle simple math, like, how do I divide 1,700 pixels by 3? Then you might work in UX development, for instance, where it's all about a visual engagement with your end user, but it requires a minimal amount of math in that mix. And so I know programmers or developers who run the gamut, from super, super nerdy, deep engineer types that can solve super complex math problems, to folks who, have never taken a higher math class at all, but have a good understanding for what they're trying to accomplish on the aesthetic side, and then use development tools to accomplish that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's really important for people to hear that, because as someone who's more on the artsy side, it would have been really nice to have that encouragement to know that if you're not as comfortable in one subject or the other, there's no harm in moving forward in the development industry or in the technology industry, because there's so much more to it. Which leads me to my next question. What's the difference between UX and UI, user experience and user interface? Can you describe some of those?
Sure. So we'll start with UI, because that's actually the more discrete, smaller answer. UI is what the user sees on the screen. That's the user interface. So if I'm in UI development, I might be creating mockups and wireframes that lay out where I want specific elements on a page to be. I'm probably good at working with CSS, which is a styling language that allows you to set, colors and shapes and line sizes and things along that line. But I'm specifically working on just that visual screen or engagement that's being created. UX relates to user experience, and that's actually a much, much bigger topic. When we talk about UX, we're really talking about what is it that I want my user to do in this particular paradigm, and then what are the steps that are going to need to happen to reach that. Now, typically a UX designer and a UI developer, or even UI designer, are probably going to work together at some point if you're in an organization that's big enough to have both. Many organizations don't have both. They have one or the other, and they are basically saddled with both roles.
Yeah.
But in a great environment, you're going to have a high-level UX designer who's going to say, okay, I want to create, let's just say, a virtual voting system for national elections, right? What are the things that need to happen here? I need to verify who my user is. I need to have them go through a registration or process. I need to do this. I need to do this. And they're going to create a bunch of flowcharts, essentially, that map out what things need to happen. And then it's their job to create a plan, a sort of a recipe for what the user interface looks like to accomplish these tasks. But their view is much more 30,000 foot. It covers all of those steps. Whereas a UI designer typically is only going to be tasked with creating layout elements or screens, one at a time, multiple at a time, depending on the project.
Copy that. So with user experience design, that sounds like what marketers do when they're talking about your customer journey, when you're going from, brand awareness all the way to a sale. That's kind of what it sounds like to me.
No, that's what good marketers do. It very much is. There, whenever I'm approaching a project, I tend to take the same steps over and over. First of all, what are my conversions, right? What are the things that I want or need my users to do to make this successful? And then I go back to the very beginning and I create user personas. Who are my users and which conversions are they going to be interested in? And then that UX is the map of that user journey between who that user is and what you're trying to get them to accomplish.
Do you create user personas based on market research, based on prospecting, or based on actual people?
Mm. I mean, me personally, I go very much people. Um, and you can do that in ways where you take advantage of market research and all the rest of that. But, usually if I'm working with a business owner, one of the questions that I ask is, okay, so who are your best customers? Literally, who are your best customers? Who are the customers that you find to be the most profitable, that you enjoy working with the most? And then I start digging in and asking, okay, so tell me about that person. And when we're spitting out user personas, in a new environment where we don't have that data to draw on, I start digging into, or I start sort of crafting who I think that theoretical person is. My guy is Joe. He's a 42-year-old divorced father of two who works as a senior administrator in a healthcare company. He's been tasked with bringing on digital transformation services within the organization, but he really has no clue what all that means. He sort of like found himself in this position after being good at some other things. He's lost. He doesn't have good data. I start working towards the problems that I know we solve to figure out who the person is who has those problems,
Yeah. And it sounds like as part of user experience, when you are, creating these personas, you find, as you said, problems that they often encounter with technology or with an app or with a website. And then your job is to then troubleshoot and fix those problems and make the design easier to navigate.
Well, and it's one of those things where there's little bits of insight that you get when you really do a good job of creating that user persona. When we're creating mobile interfaces, for instance, the vast majority of people in the world are right-handed and are going to hold their phone in their right hand and will often have their phone in that one hand while doing other things with their other hand. So in thinking about that, I try to make sure that our user experience focuses on the sweep range of that right thumb while holding the phone in one hand. Those are UX and UI decisions that work together to create something that's really functional for the user, but not something that you really think about right off the bat when you're like, let me create a pretty design,
Oh, yeah. I mean, I really love that you brought that up because it's one thing to design something that looks really nice, but it's another thing for it to be nice and functional. And the whole sweeping motion of, the right hand with your thumb and scrolling across the screen while I'm like stirring my pasta with my other hand, that's something I never would have thought about. So I'm really glad you brought that up. It's very interesting.
I think
When
it
it
was Werner
comes,
Braun who said that all good design is functional. And if it's not, then it's not good design.
yeah. That makes me wonder, like, what is the function of some of these most like obscure sculptures that you find in some of these cities? And it's like this sculpture that looks like a pasta noodle or something. My mind's on pasta, apparently. Anyway, so going back to user interface development, what is that, first of all? That's like on my screen right here, I've got StreamYard and I've got like where I need to click on my banners and where I need to click on my text. And I've got, I can see how many people are watching right now. Thank you guys for tuning in. I can see how many people liked and hearted this. Thank you guys for the love. So that's all part of the user interface development, right? So is the user interface developer someone who is also thinking of the design of the layout and doing code in addition to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're at a place in technology where you can't really get away from the code. If all you're doing is purely drawing, an Illustrator, and you're like, hey, here's what a nice screen could be. If you don't have an understanding of the functionality behind that makes that work, then you're probably not going to be a great designer. Most of the designers that I work with professionally have a good understanding, whether or not they put any code in themselves, they at least understand the function of the code and how those things tie together. They have some sense of how it was built. Products at scale, large products with large development teams, I mean, Facebook and StreamYard and some of these other tools, generally you're going to have what we call a separation of interests. And that breaks down into what we sort of loosely call front end versus back end. And believe me, those are very, very loose descriptives, and they are heavily disputed and debated in the community. So I'm not going to like weigh in on any of that. But just from a layperson's perspective, front end development is working on the parts that people see, right? And back end development is working on the engines and the data stores and all the rest of that drive front end. So, there is some consideration for the front end side when you're a backend developer, because you're understanding that you have to deliver data in certain formats and what those requirements are going to be. And on the front end,
when you talk about delivering data in certain formats, does that mean like .pdf, .png? Is that what that means?
Well, I mean more along the lines of structured data, not necessarily file formats.
Okay.
So structured data is probably going to be, JSON, for instance, is a form of structured data. XML is another form of structured data. So these are ways where a front end can have a sort of a connector to the back end data system, and it knows that it's going to get the data for this view in a particular structure. So it's able to take that structure and start wrapping visual elements around it. For a list of Facebook posts, you might get a big JSON object that comes back, and it's post A by Siobhan and post B by Chris and post C by somebody else. And that's going to be structured in such a way that the design components of that application know how to wrap those design elements around each of those little pieces. When it's in, it's just a series of text values, but what comes out of it is that visual display that you see.
That's all very interesting. And I'm wondering, how do we make this less scary for someone who's in high school who is thinking, oh, I don't know if tech is for me, but maybe tech really is for them. Like how would you make this more not user friendly? That sounds like a pun that just didn't work.
I mean, it's kind of funny because your job with good software is to make it user-friendly. So, maybe introducing people to software in a more user-friendly way is exactly the right philosophy for it. I encourage people to play. I mean, to me, that's one of the biggest things. Every time because I've trained a lot of people over the years on how to use various pieces of software that I use. I always try to give them the rough guidelines of how to use it. But in any piece of, reasonably complex software, you're going to have a lot of options that aren't really obvious right off the bat. You're going to have things that you can do that you didn't know that you could do at the beginning. Playing with it is like how you figure those things out. And so one of the easiest ways that you can start with, if you are dead new to any of this, if you've never written a single line of CSS in your life or something along that line, you can go spin up a WordPress blog for free, basically just about anywhere, and use some of their default themes and start playing with, go find some like CSS tutorials and use that built-in interface to start writing a little bit of CSS and seeing out, I created this class that changed the color of this text, or that changed the size of it, or that changed the font of it. And when you start relating how you can code, essentially, I mean, some programmers would argue about whether or not CSS is code, but that's a whole other conversation. When you start getting a sense of...
That was going to be my next question. You're reading my mind, man. I was just going to ask, is CSS a code? Because I've heard of JavaScript.
I mean, it's us development nerds.
I told you we'd open a can of worms.
There's several I guarantee I'll be hearing about from the development community later. There are some lively arguments about whether things like CSS and HTML are code per se, or whether they constitute more along the lines of a markup language, which to people who don't know what code is a difference that doesn't make any sense to them anyways, because if they don't know what a markup language is, that who cares, whether you're calling it one or the other. To me, the argument is uninteresting when we're talking about bringing these things to laymen, because it really is getting down into the nerdy nitty gritty of it. CSS is a code type set of rules that you can use to target what we call selectors in a web page or in an interface of some sort, and that might be some title text, or it might be like a wrapper around some particular display element or something. And then once you've targeted that selector, you can apply style properties to it. So change the color, change the background, put an image in the back, make the text bigger, or something along that line. If you are brand new to this space and you've never, played with code at all, I think CSS is a fun way to start engaging with thinking about the idea of, I can construct logical rules using text that then become a visual interface or that affect the display, and if you find that appealing in the slightest, then yeah, JavaScript is actually, you mentioned JavaScript, that's a great place to start learning what most developers would consider a real programming language. And even then, some developers are still going to disagree that JavaScript doesn't meet the requirements.
Yeah, I almost wrote in this ticker under here, CSS is a fun starting point for new programmers. And I'm like, I don't want to start any wars. So I wrote learners.
That's probably a better usage, yeah.
Or students. I could change it to students, but is jQuery a markup format? See, I'm learning too,
you are
guys.
really Googling for some heavy questions here.
You guys, I had to prepare. First of all, if you don't know, I'm a theater major. Okay. I had to do some serious Google searches in order to prepare for today. All right. So yeah, no, I saw that jQuery is like, it's somehow related to JavaScript, but it's not exactly a code itself. Can you describe the difference between JavaScript and jQuery? Because it kind of sounds like CSS falls in a similar category as jQuery.
Sort of working in the right direction, but that's okay. We'll get there. So
Awesome.
jQuery is what's called a framework. And frameworks are great in development because what frameworks do is they package up a lot of common things that you would normally have to write a bunch of code for, and they just make them really easy functions. So instead of me having to write this whole thing about, okay, when I click on this button here, I want it to morph out and expand into a full screen thing that has new things inside it. Well, jQuery is a framework that is written in JavaScript. It's a JavaScript framework. That has a bunch of this stuff already packaged. You might have you might have a little variable that's called like screen, and just to keep it really layman here, please jQuery people, don't at me. You might have a screen.getBigger, right? Well, the get bigger part would be the sort of jQuery function that you're calling in that allows for this advanced display change to occur. And jQuery got super popular because it's bundled with WordPress. It was one of the most common like interface frameworks out there for a long time. I think these days a lot of modern developers prefer other frameworks. React and Vue are two very popular JavaScript frameworks that have replaced jQuery. But yeah, frameworks are awesome. In fact, one of the reasons why I got into WordPress so aggressively early on was because they have their own PHP API that makes it easy to do a lot of content related stuff, to query the database and return content objects and sometimes create like really, really complex functionality. And they just do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So as a lazy developer in particular, having frameworks is great because it saves you the time and the hassle. And it also makes for better maintainability. If you're working in React, then other developers who know React can just jump right in. Whereas if you have written all this stuff yourself, what we call homegrown applications, they have to come in and learn your application specifically. They might be the greatest JavaScript developer in the world, but they have to figure out what kind of hot shit you've like boiled together in a pan to make this thing work. And, that can be scary. So frameworks make life easier.
Yeah, it sounds like if I can attempt to make an analogy, and you can correct me if this is totally inaccurate, it sounds like framework is syntax to language, and language being code, which isn't the best analogy, saying it out loud. Like even as a layman, I'm like, it's not quite right.
It's more like this. If I want to build a house, right? I need some wood and I need some power tools and I need some connectors and fasteners and all the rest of that thing. Now I can be, Paul Bunyan out in the woods with an axe and like chop down trees and do all this stuff. Gotcha. Or I can call Home Depot and be like, hey, why don't you drop me off some power saw and some nails and some 2x4s at this size and blah, 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 blah. And boom, it's already done. So now I can start building my house instead of having to build the parts that I use to build my house.
You guys, tech isn't scary. That makes sense. I love it. That totally makes sense to me. Oof. All right. So what is considered an entry level job in tech development?
I mean, the role that is sort of colloquially known as web designer is probably a common job. Often we call those junior developers or dev ones at this point. But there are a few others as well. Like it really heavily depends on the industry. BAs, business analysts, and PAs, programmer analysts. You can have BA1s and PA1s, and each of those is going to be very much on a learning track, but in different ways. Like a business analyst, your role is going to be taking complex financial data and putting it into visualized forms that make it easy for business managers to make decisions about. And that means that you're probably going to have to write some SQL queries against a database, and you're going to have to know how to coalesce data from multiple sources. Programmer analysts, sometimes their focus is more on when you have large, really, really broad applications with tons of inputs and outputs like ERP or big enterprise class systems. Programmer analysts are often looking at the workflows of very front end, smaller modular sets of functionality. Web designers, I'm sorry, is it going over your head already?
It totally is. But you know what? Here's why this is all good. It's all good, right? Because if someone is truly interested in this, they're going to hear all of these words going over my head, and they're going to do their Google searches, and they're going to start doing their research. So just you describing all of this, you're throwing out a ton of keywords. You're just like throwing seeds out everywhere, right? And someone's going to take that seed and water it. And just this tree of knowledge and career development is going to emerge from this show, right? We're like Inception. But anyway, continue. Don't let my glossed over look distract you.
I mean, it just kind of depends on what you're interested in, because there is such a broad span of starter positions. You know, I mean, like if you want to get into native app development for iOS or Android devices, you might come in and just be designing screens for apps in a small shop, and that's what they need done. Is like, okay, place here, and your partner over here is actually writing the logic for the app. And so you might touch a little bit of code, maybe some CSS or maybe some little bits of other little things, but not doing a whole lot. But the point is you're being exposed to it. And even in roles that aren't necessarily development centric, if they're development adjacent, you can still get some value out of that. For instance, if you're working tech support or a help desk, that's an easy way for you to start becoming familiar with the product itself and the technology behind that product. But it also provides you opportunities to begin engaging and interfacing with developers in that organization to start asking questions and digging in and getting a sense of how it works, you know? And really, that's probably one of the best ways to get started.
So I was going to ask, how can students stand out? But before I ask that, I think I actually want to ask, how can I figure out what interests me? You know, because some people, I mean, come on, we've all been there. We've all been in high school, and we're like, everyone's telling me I have to make a decision as to what college I want to go to. I have to like at 16 years old know what I want to do with the rest of my life, and then go do it and just dump a bunch of money into education. And that's a really big decision, and it can be a really tough decision for some kids. And even for kids like myself who knew exactly what they wanted to do, end up changing their career anyway. So, you know, what advice do you have for people who are just trying to figure it out, who don't know exactly what in development they want to pursue?
Well, in high school, I wanted to be a rock star, and I was the bass player in a garage band. And in my early 20s, I wanted to be a chef, and I was a line cook. I think
That's awesome.
The first thing that I recommend, and maybe it's just because I'm sort of an all over the place and explorer type anyways, is just go touch things, go play. Again, the same thing that I recommend for software, I recommend for careers in general. Go play, go get a job, while your expenses are low and you can afford to work at a minimal wage, not necessarily minimum wage, but at a lesser, competing high-end wage or whatever else, while life is cheap, just go explore a little bit, go work as a line cook, see what that's like. deliver some pizzas, whatever. Just go touch a few different things, work at a pet shop, intern at a veterinary clinic. I mean, there's so many different types of things that you can do. And with technology, you don't even necessarily have to be working for a company to do any of this stuff. You can totally just be like, okay, I want to try and make my own game, right? And then you can go Google, how do I make a game using code or whatever? And you'll get some recommendations and some packages, and you'll find there are so many free resources online where you can find really great tutorials on how to build things and just try and build something. See how it feels to you,
You are a true industry explorer.
Oh, I've worked in a few of them.
I actually I'm like really honored. I just the amount of different things that you had considered doing and that you actually did try is so interesting to me, and I think that's like the whole purpose of industry explorers. But I will say, to me, my philosophy at this point in life is if you never want to worry about not having a job, you need to work on skills. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in or what job title you have. You need to focus on what you're learning wherever you're at, and then take that with you as you progress in life. So when you were a line cook, how did that experience help you as the chief digital officer that you are today?
That's an interesting question.
I live for those reactions. As a host, I'm like, yes.
I mean, the thing about being a line cook is that it's all process driven, right? You are not the head chef. It is not your job to reinvent recipes on the fly. It's your job to be an efficient member of a team that's working under high stress, high pressure, short timelines in a really unforgiving environment. I mean, it's 110 degrees on average, and you get splashed with hot grease. You're going to cut yourself. You're going to touch a burner. It is, you have to like be cool and calm and collected and process engaged despite all of these things that are potentially obstacles that are going to trip you up and fuck up the end result. And so like, if you can do well in that environment, you will probably do quite well in development if you can learn those skills, because we frequently have these same situations where when a product is down, like major platforms, when Google goes down, when Slack goes down, when any of these tools go down, hundreds of thousands of dollars can be lost in minutes in these systems. And so it turns a war zone inside your company during that time frame, when you're up against hard deadlines, when you've got product launches that are scheduled tomorrow and you're not finished with QA. It can be a very high pressure environment. If you did well as a line cook for a couple of years and you were able to operate in that space with all of the shitty things that come along with that, and you can develop development skills, you will probably do well.
I love that. I'm wondering, what if we did get some line cooks here that decided, I am interested in tech. I'm interested in becoming a developer, and they make that switch. Where should they start? And is it a good idea to include their line cook their line cook experience on their resume in addition to the rest of their portfolio, to talk about, being in the unforgiving environment, and to talk about working with these processes, and to, being under these tight deadlines? What do you think about that?
Well, I'll say that I didn't put my line cook experience on my resume when I was hustling for the position, but that's also because I knew that a bunch of other folks would have things that I didn't have: the college degree, the summer of code at Google, any of the rest of that. And so I just really focused my resume on the things that most contributed to the role that I was applying for. That being said, if I was given the opportunity in an interview to say, what's something from your work experience that you think helps qualify you, I might very well bring that kind of thing up, because it's, stress management in development can be challenging if if there are significant market factors impacting that, or if it's a high availability app or something along that line. Mm-hmm. Knowing that someone is capable of operating in a calm, cool fashion when the stress gets high, that's that's definitely something that contributes to, a hiring decision for sure. And I think that people who have worked several years in a line cook position might find it kind of funny when other people are stressing out in a development environment, because they're like, really? This is it? Nah,
Yeah.
I got this. I once cooked for 37 people with my shoes literally on fire, so this is not that bad.
Did that happen to you?
I've never burned my shoes off, but it just seems not an unreasonable thing that might occur.
Wow. Maybe we should get John Favreau here and see what he thinks, since he's all up in that scene right now.
I love John Favreau, and he really is. He's exactly kind of, I think, where I would love to circle back around. Somebody who had a passion for food, who did do a little line cooking when he was younger, but got into entertainment, but he still had so much love for the space that he kept coming back to it. And then he did, chef, of course, and now is driving this creation of all these new food shows that are all just directly expressions of his passion. I love that, and I would love to do similar things.
Yeah. I'd love to sit with both of you and interview both of you at the same time. I think that'd be such a wild conversation. How fun would that be?
I'm here for it, believe me.
So, all right. How can students stand out? You mentioned the summer at Google. What is that?
Well, Summer of Code. It's there are a number,
not Summer of Love, but Summer of Code.
Yeah, that's
Summer coding. Got me C+.
And there's the theater major. So there are a number of like boot camps and summer programs and internships and things along that line where you can get some real world experience and engage with people who are, real players in the space, senior developers, senior software engineers, architects, and really like sponge that knowledge up. Those are great things to get involved with if you can. Hackathons as well. If you've got a little bit of experience under your belt and you want to find some things to add to your resume a little more, hackathons are great because you can randomly pair up with a handful of other folks that are all at the hackathon with you, and work on a product in real time and get a sense of what it's like to work on a product in a company environment. But instead, you're just on a casual team and you're maybe competing for a cash prize or something along that line. But one of the most important things, there's two things that I always tell every developer. If you want to move forward, if you want to stand out, if you want to grow in this industry, the two things that I'm always going to look for are a public repo. And that's going to be something like GitHub or similar repositories where I can literally look at code that you've written, projects that you've created and worked on, even if it's basic stuff, even if you forked somebody else's commonly available repo and made a few changes to stand up your own website using that software or whatever. Having that public repo is really important. It's your developer's portfolio, so to speak. And there's no fine artists out there who wouldn't immediately be able to provide you with examples of their work. As a developer, you should be taking that exact same approach. Here's what it looks like. Here's code that I've worked on, and let me get some sort of sense of, okay, what does your formatting look like? What does your syntax look like? How did you structure logic inside these things? Those are really, really great things to see. But that's almost not even as important as having your own developer's blog. And the thing that I want to see in your developer's blog is every time you solve a hard problem, write up a description of that problem and your solution to it and put it out there. And that shows me two huge things and then one slightly lesser thing. First, it shows me how you solve problems. Right. And you're really walking through the mental path of that when you're writing these tutorials. Well, here's the problem that I ran into. I tried this. It didn't work. I tried these things, but I ran into this wall, but I was able to figure out a solution for that. And then here's what the finished product looks like. That kind of stuff as a hiring manager is fantastic because that gives me a real sense of what it's going to look like when I've hired you and you're in the desk working on actual production problems. Two, it gives me some sense of your written communication skills, which is also very important because often in development, you're going to have to write reports or outline problems and communicate that frequently in a written fashion with your team members, with management, and all the rest of that. And so it helps to see what that language looks like. And then 3, something that is really subtle, but I think is really critically important, how well you're able to break that down into easy to understand language. It really takes almost no time at all for a developer to make someone's eyes glaze over. I've done it to you at least twice on this call. And so like really finding those house building analogies, finding easy ways that are understandable to communicate these things, especially given that frequently you're going to be working with a business segment who is decidedly non-technical. And if they've asked for something and you can't reasonably deliver that, or there are some obstacles to delivering that, you need to be able to communicate that in a fashion that they'll understand. Development and marketing work hand in hand almost everywhere. You're going to be partner businesses with very, very different types of people who have completely different skill sets and completely different technological levels of understanding. And you have to be able to communicate things in a way that doesn't sound like you're just saying, I don't feel like it, which is oftentimes what people hear when developers say this can't be done. They're like, oh, well, it could be done. I saw it on Google's site. Yeah, well, Google has $1 billion budget and you don't. You have to understand, like, and learning the business case side of thing takes time. But I think that people who, are conscientious enough to try to make their explanations clear tend to do well more so than people who don't. I've read some super dry technical white papers that are really great if you're an expert in the space, but they're completely inaccessible to anyone who's not,
I would love to know specifically what makes you irreplaceable.
Ooh, me personally. I mean, realistically, it's probably the fact that I just tick so many boxes. I've such a broad skill set, and it comes from experience mostly. My development skill set itself, I mean, it's the vast majority of my friends who are developers are better developers than I am. I have a ton of friends who are actual senior software engineers who build high-end products, who just really create amazing things. I'm a functional developer who can solve development problems, and that's an important part of the skill set. But I'm also a team builder, a pretty fair architect, a process engineer. I understand the management side of the equation. I understand the sales and marketing side of the equation. And I've spent, the last 5 years in an executive management role where all of those skills have to come together to do the job well. So it really is, you can become hyper specialized. And I know some people my age who they are hyper specialized. They are working on one type of code in one type of environment, and they are paid extremely well to do that. And they're very satisfied and fulfilled. For me, being a serial entrepreneur and being someone who likes the business side of the equation, you've got to tick off as many of those boxes as possible. And you have to understand how your core skill set fits into all of the other skill sets.
So as a chief digital officer, you have to tie in all of those different aspects together in your role with the Symphony Agency?
Yeah, fundamentally, the role of a chief digital officer is to affect digital transformation across the organization. And that's a very buzzword heavy kind of phrase, but what it really means is it's your job to make sure that the data moves into the organization, through the organization, and out of the organization in the cleanest and most efficient and most accessible way possible. And so you have to understand the business case of each group in your organization. You have to understand how process engineering works and the ability to diagram flows of both human process and data throughout an organization, looking for the weak spots and where things are broken, so if you're going to be in a digital officer role, if you're going to be in charge of digital transformation, you have to understand the business as a whole to be good at your job.
So sorry, I had like 2 questions that popped up. What does it mean to be an architect?
So let's go back to our house building analogy, right? I'm the developer and I've got my nicely trimmed out planks and I've got my suite of power tools and I've got my day labor crew that's going to help me with the heavy lifting. Where's my plan? Architects, build
Right.
blueprints for a house that say, okay, here are how all the pieces work together. Here's where you should connect things. And then, by the way, here are 8 different systems that all have to live, plumbing, electrical, data, etc., that all have to live inside this plan as well. And architect's job is to map all that out and put that together. And with a good understanding of where the important things are. Okay, this is a load-bearing log. It can't be moved. If it does, the roof falls in, right? Software is very much the same way. You have disparate systems that all have to play nicely together. You have strain and stress points like that load-bearing log. It might be the actual concurrent number of connections possible to your database. It might be how you deploy cloud services to dynamically scale. I'm super throwing out the buzzwords now.
It's all good.
But the point is, an architect's job is to understand how all those pieces work together and to build plans that developers can then implement. And the architect has to have that 30,000-foot view because the developers themselves generally might only be working on their specific part of the application, and they may not necessarily see that big picture view. So they might make decisions that, aren't good for the entire process. A good architect is going to be able to see that, to outline where those pain points are, and to give every individual participant a roadmap so that they can be successful in achieving that common business goal.
So how is being an architect different from being a UX designer or a UI developer? Because it sounds kind of similar to either of those.
It's very much not. So again, an architect has a top-down view of the entire process, right? A UX designer is talking about the flow of the users, right? Of what the experience should be and what the goals are to reach. The UI designer is focused on how does that interface look and does it help achieve the UX goals. The architect is the one who's going, okay, so that's the UI UX stuff. And then over here, I have the data stack stuff. And over here, I have the business logic stuff. And over here, I have a middleware platform. And by the way, that middleware platform also has to support language translations because we're serving this out to 8 different countries. And if we get hit 3 or 4 times a year around certain holidays, which radically increase the number of people hitting our server at the same time, so we have to have a plan that dynamically solves for that and doesn't just make the whole thing fall over. The architect is that big picture perspective.
I love it. Makes sense. Thank you for that explanation. Why is diversity in technology and development important? How does the industry benefit and how do end users benefit?
Well, I think this is such a great topic because it's been chewed on a lot and there's a lot of, I think some people just automatically feel resistant anytime they see the word diversity anywhere. It just sort of makes them clench up a little bit. And by a lot of people, I mean people who aren't necessarily part of a diversity initiative, without calling anyone who looks like me out directly. So the purpose of the benefit of diversity in tech is that it provides for a broad viewpoint and a broad set of ideas and a broad set of perspectives that all come together to contribute to make better products. And a great example of this recently is in the use of AI, especially AI in things like facial recognition. A lot of the AI systems that are out there have been trained with tons and tons and tons and tons of very mainstream white male face data and do a shit job at detecting differences in, for instance, black faces or Asian faces or other, any other phenomenology that's not included in this broad data collection set. And it's a blind spot that occurs because there's not enough diversity in those groups building the software. They don't even think about it. It's like, oh yeah, it works great. Bob, worked great for you. Yep, Jim, worked great for me. Without even realizing that that's such a poor representation. And if you're building a planet class application and you're not really functionally focused on how many different types of people there are, that's a huge fail. And it's an example of how a lack of diversity and perspective leads to failures, diversity-based failures in the actual end result of the product. If I will never forget, I saw this banner for a tech conference or something like that, and it was a panel called Women in Business. 8 speakers, all of them white males. And I'm like, Okay, well, that's
What?
a perspective that's being represented, Um,
Oh
these blind
gosh.
spots are just, and it's like, it's literally an example of a
Yeah.
blind spot within a blind spot, because who at that board approved this panel, and when, and nobody was like, well, maybe we should include a woman in here. You know, it's
Mhm.
so it just creates this very limited perspective. It's self-reinforcing. It creates echo chambers. Everyone's had similar experiences. They have similar worldviews. They all are agreeing that this is the thing, and then they hit the actual market, and the market is diverse as fuck.
Mhm.
And if you're operating
Yeah.
with blind spots, all of a sudden your product starts hitting these obstacles because you didn't encourage diversity in your own structural organization, in your own unit,
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's almost like you can have a much more functioning program if you have the perspective, a diverse perspective, and thereby improving the experience that the users of your program have. So
And it's really
thereby
functional. I mean, it's
increase
not even
the bottom line,
exactly.
right? Like after all is said and done, you want to be the best. So you want more people using your platforms and your programs, and that drives dollars, right?
And
So
you want to solve problems, right? That's where we started, and that's where we're sort of coming around to here at the end. This is all about solving
mhm,
problems. But if the only problems that you see are the problems that people exactly like you face, when you actually hit the marketplace, which is comprised of way more than people just like you, you start seeing those hits to the bottom line. This has never been more true, like in the case of accessibility in software. If you've got software that isn't capable of being used by people who can't see or who can't hear or things along that line, people who are differently
mhm.
able on any number of directions, like, you're losing that marketplace, and you're creating a bad taste in the public's mouth, because you're not serving that marketplace well. Having a diverse organization with a broad number of perspectives represented helps you solve those problems in advance.
I am curious to know when I pay attention to conversations revolving around diversity. Typically, it has to do with universities or getting jobs. But when we're talking about diversifying companies, when someone has the counter argument, oh, well, the only reason they got where they are today is because they're different. They're a woman, or they're Asian, they're black, or whatever. That's the only reason they're here. And it's like, people, the counter argument is, oh, well, they're not here based on merit. But this is all about perspective, right? It's all about having a diverse perspective in order to better solve problems. In which case, I feel like that destroys the merit based argument, right? Plus, don't a
Yeah,
lot of companies do they offer training?
the,
Like once you're in the door, you get onboarded, you get a certain amount of training, right? What do you think about people who make comments like that?
the merit-based argument is bullshit. It really
Yeah.
is.
I mean, I agree. Yeah.
The fact is, nobody's out there hiring a not qualified person, and I'll say nobody with the qualifier that maybe somebody has somewhere or something, but that's clearly not the case happening everywhere, or these companies would just be dying because, oh, we met our quota of whatever, which, by the way, quotas are bullshit too. They don't exist. I've never seen one in my life. So like, it's not about that at all. Hire the right person for the job, and by the right person, I mean the person who is most qualified for that position, regardless of any of the rest of these things. However, a number of the actual hiring and recruitment processes along the way begin to exhibit bias early on. Where these job listings are posted, how they're posted, what language they're posted in. There are a number of things during the process of recruiting where you're not going to reach people who can help diversify your perspective, and so they never even get a chance to compete. It's not a merit-based contest if they never even show up in the list. And there are
Mhm.
internal hiring processes that are well documented in major organizations, where you see things like hiring managers throwing away resumes of people with names they can't pronounce, right? And those are internal recruitment. That's the opposite of affirmative action. Just going to make sure that's clear to anyone listening, right?
Mm-hmm.
This whole idea that we have these AA hires who are just here to fill a role, that's ridiculous. What you do have is a system that is by default built to stifle diversity, and you need to make sure that you're finding those places where you're creating obstacles to diversity and remove them and really make it a fair ground, and then hire the best person for the job regardless of any of the rest of those things. But make sure that the opportunity to compete is fair, and that's a good starting point.
What should tech companies do to improve their recruitment strategies?
Wow, that's a big topic.
Yep.
I mean, that's, again, start with the internal audit. See, take a look historically, and you should be, collecting some data about the applications you receive and the efforts that you're using. Do some real deep dive analysis there and make sure that you're not institutionalizing bias in your actual practices internally. But then, when you're going out there, if you're reaching certain organizations or you're going to certain schools or things along that line, then make sure that you are doing the effort and putting in the legwork to say, if you're going to be at Harvard, well, go hit an HBU in the same day and run a recruitment drive there. Look around at where you're distributing your message and how you're getting out there, and make sure that it's targeted appropriately, so that it reaches everyone. And you know what? If you have to do a little bit of extra legwork to make sure that message gets broader, I mean, you're really like stretching to call that affirmative action. If I specifically go look for organizations of differently able developers, and I want to make sure that my job listing is seen by them, well, call me a bleeding heart, but I feel like that's worth the effort in creating a more diverse workspace. And that's certainly not saying, oh, hey, we're only going to hire this person, but it's really, it means that you've made diversity a focus. You understand the value of what it contributes to an organization. And so you do a little bit of extra legwork on that recruiting side to make sure that those opportunities are seen far and wide.
What can companies do to improve their retention strategies? Where do you think there is higher turnover in development?
Those are two interesting questions.
Yeah, I kind of want to know, like, where is the highest amount of turnover, and what can companies do to improve retention?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big connection between those two things is that in most cases it's not money, and I know a lot of people think they are, or think that it is. They think you'll do anything for the right amount of money. And yet I've walked out of jobs that I just couldn't take anymore that paid me very well, just because I couldn't stand to work there another day, and I didn't even have anything lined up. I'm like, I don't know what's happening in the next 2 weeks. So I'm going to be hustling, but I just cannot do this another day. The biggest things that have always been important to me are, hire that right person at the beginning, make sure they're the right person for the job. But then generally as a manager, I give them the tools they need to do their job, and then I get the fuck out of the way. And then there's a few other things along the way that contribute to a long-term good relationship, which would be like acknowledging your employees' successes. Never take the credit for a solution that somebody who works for you has created. Really acknowledge the contribution that people put into the organization and reward them appropriately. If you're doing those kinds of things in the organization, your retention is going to be pretty good on average. Bad bosses are the number one reason that people leave. So if you've got high turnover, look at your middle management, especially, and your middle management better have some good answers, including coming back and saying, you know what, you as a senior manager are my fucking problem, and I can't treat my people well enough because you haven't given me the budget or given me this or given me that. In that case, maybe, okay, now this is a senior management issue. I'm fine with that. But if you're seeing high turnover, the first place to look is middle management. See what's going on there, because people quit over bad bosses more than anything else.
Very true. Do you have any thoughts on STEM programs?
Well, I have lots of thoughts on STEM programs.
I'd love to hear a few.
Yeah, I think STEM is so fundamental to almost every industry out there, period. It doesn't matter what you're in. STEM as a core is what helps develop the technology, what helps develop the new sciences, and many of the problems that we look at in regards to, environmental sustainability and socioeconomic trajectory and just tons and tons and tons of big picture objects are solved by people in STEM. So, I mean, it's an industry where if you have any interest at all, I encourage you to be there. But it is also kind of like a line cook industry because it's hard work that's often underpaid and, you rarely get the acknowledgement that you deserve for the work that you put in. It's a handful of people get the highest paying jobs. That's, all of those things are very much the case in that industry as much as anywhere else. And STEM has had a number of issues with diversity over the years that, have made it perhaps a hostile workforce, especially to women, as we've seen. But I think that there are some recent trends, that sort of show an encouraging shift in that. I mean, over the last 15 years or so, women are now outpacing men graduating from university. There are more degrees coming out of there. It means there's more women scientists coming out than are men scientists. There's lots of sort of social shifts that I think can start to offset the disparity and make it a more welcoming environment and less of the old boys club, so to speak. The rise of great global communications and collaborations platforms means that emerging economies are able to more participate into, say, Western Hemisphere STEM projects and things along that line, and really be acknowledged as contributors to that space because they've often been neglected, and we've seen their work repurposed by Western STEM organizations and presented as something new when perhaps it wasn't. So, I think that it's earned its bad reputation in the past, but there have been significant moves over the last decade or so that are starting to turn things in the right direction.
As far as STEM programs are concerned. Did you happen to see the Avoid Toxic Workplaces live stream that I did with Jill Pestana?
I did not, sadly.
I invite you to check it out. And I invite anyone listening to this to check it out as well, because that one is all about avoiding toxic workplaces. And Jill has a background in STEM. She is a scientist and she has experienced some horrible things as a female scientist. So she has the STEM Thrive Guides where she helps up and coming professionals navigate through difficult situations. And so if you are an individual or if you are a faculty member or a teacher, professor, business owner, I highly recommend that you check out the STEM Thrive Guides and see what Jill has to offer. And I really enjoyed having her on this show to talk about how to navigate some of those difficult situations. So
cool.
So yeah, definitely. Awesome. All right. Well, we are over an hour. We didn't even get to the future of digital healthcare. So I'm just going to open this can of worms because why not? You work in the healthcare communication space. What does the future of digital healthcare look like?
So, one of the things that's kind of funny about healthcare is everybody, I think when they talk about modern healthcare, there's this sort of image that comes to mind of shiny surgical units with lasers and CAT scan machines and fancy graphics, but the fact is the vast majority of healthcare has been so change resistant over the last 20 years. I joined WebMD Practice Services in 2003 and we were dragging doctors out of paper records back then, and that battle has been ongoing all this time. There's all these tools that are available to every kind of business, but because a combination of compliance and regulatory issues, but also just a really old school perspective about how medicine is practiced. That's a whole philosophical conversation that you can get three old doctors and, feed them a few scotches and ask them that question. And they'll go on for hours about, this is how medicine should be practiced. All the way that we as consumers have are interacting and engaging with our consultants, our professionals, our masseuses, our barbers, our grocery stores, Instacart's bringing my food, and Drizzly's bringing me some cocktails, and Uber Eats has got dinner on lock. And all of these digital platforms have radically transformed so much about the consumer space, and yet healthcare seems to always lag about 10 to 15 years behind. And so when you really think about, let's talk about one of the biggest pains in the ass in our country with healthcare is the whole insurance model and not being able to effectively price shop for healthcare. Mm-hmm. You don't have any clue what one doctor charges versus the next for the same services. You just sort of walk in and they're like, okay, it's $150 for this appointment. You're like, oh, okay, well, here's my 150. Jesus, and maybe a just as great doctor down the street is $95 for the same visit. We don't have a really significant ways, like a nice national platform to provide consumers with the tools that they need to effectively make good healthcare decisions. And so because of that, in combination with a really barbaric insurance system, our consumer healthcare scores and quality of life in the US are way, way down in the world. I mean, like 47th or 49th compared, like behind all other major developed countries.
Where do those where do those statistics come from?
They are collected by organizations like the World Health Organization and similar NGOs as well, who literally do quality of life and quality of care surveys across healthcare organizations in multiple countries and then compile all that data together. And we're not saying like, competing based on, sort of arbitrary things. We're talking about measuring quality of care and outcome for those patients. So, whereas cancer survivors in certain European countries might have a 12-year expected lifespan past diagnosis, in some of these instances, we're at like a 5 to 7 year lifespan. Like just measuring outcomes, and especially once you factor in the cost, we pay more for worse healthcare. And that's a place where technology can solve a lot of those problems as we start opening it up, allowing consumers more visibility into what their options are, making it more convenient, giving consumers more power to manage their own healthcare as opposed to being reliant on HMOs or hospitalists or, third-party administrators. And a lot of that, it's all digital healthcare stuff, great apps, great platforms, and your data on hand right now. If I ask anybody that I know, hey, go get me your medical records, they wouldn't have a clue where to start. Your healthcare records should be on your mobile device in your pocket. That's what the future of digital healthcare looks like. But we're going to have to drag the industry kicking and screaming to it.
You know what? But it sounds like it's all going to be for the better, both as far as cost is concerned and as far as health is concerned, like for an individual. I actually started going to therapy and I started using BetterHelp. It's an app, and I really love how accessible my therapist is. I can just, throughout my day, if I have a random thought and I want to share that thought, like I don't have to, like, I don't forget about it. I just write in a journal entry and it automatically gets sent to my therapist, and then boom, he's coming back with comments about it, and it's awesome. So, accessibility, that's another thing. It's going to improve cost. It's going to improve, health, and it's going to improve accessibility. I'm all for it. So, I know there's so much more we could talk about with that can of worms, but we do need to wrap up this show. And thank you guys for tuning in. Great show, Siobhan. You're killing it. I'm so proud of you, my friend. Oh, thank you, Facebook user. I love you too. I have to go back and see who that is. I love when I get a secret admirer. Well, I'm really honored that you all tuned in and that you all gave us your love and your time. Jinx, thank you so much. Victor Bolivar said UFMB is missing from his bio. This is true.
That's true. Unfuck my business. Shout out to
Unfuck my business.
Workers.
We've only done three F-bombs in this whole episode. That's amazing. For us. Hopefully YouTube doesn't catch that last one, right? Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Jinx, it was so wonderful having you. I'm sure we'll do more of these because that's what kids are interested in. They're interested in getting into tech. They're interested in, programming, coding. So I can't wait to, help my fellow explorers explore different career possibilities. So,
I'm
do you
like
have any
Wu
last?
Tang. I do it for the children.
Oh. Do you have any last minute words of wisdom or advice or f bombs?
Whatever you're interested in, whatever you're thinking about, whether it's tech, whether it's anything else, jump in, play with it, try it, go do it, taste it, sample it. That's the best possible way. Don't just like go, yeah, I could do that. Maybe, I don't know. Go try it.
Fuck yeah.
Fuck yeah.
And on that note, explorers, thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you on our next adventure. Take care.